It seems like the world is against Israel right now. And prophecies do foretell that this will happen, but Israel will never be taken from the Jews again. God's hand is upon Israel, and she is very mighty. And we will discuss one aspect of her might on today's edition of End of the Age. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dave Robbins with Time Ministries, and I thank you so much for joining me on this edition of End of the Age. Now, like I said, it seems like a lot of the world is against Israel, and there's a reason for that. Satan himself has been fighting God for Israel and Jerusalem for thousands of years now. And it's all going to lead to the Battle of Armageddon. That's going to be the culmination of this thing when God will do away with human government and establish His government here on the earth. But I'm going to clear up some misconceptions and kind of overturn the international community's false narrative against Israel. And that's what I want to do with today's program, and to show you that God is with Israel, and Israel is very mighty. In Zechariah chapter 12, verse 2 through 3, the Bible says, "Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of drunkenness to all the surrounding people, when they will lay siege against Judah and Jerusalem." Now, this is at the Battle of Armageddon. Zechariah chapter 12, 13, and 14 is the Battle of Armageddon. And the Bible says, "And it shall happen in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy, very heavy stone, a burdensome stone for all people. All who would heave it away will surely be cut into pieces, though all nations of the earth are gathered against it." And so it just seems like, that we're watching precursors to that time when the world will come against Israel. The world's against Israel right now. You know that the International Criminal Court, the chief prosecutor, Fatwa Benswada, she just authorized a probe into alleged Israel war crimes in the Palestinian Authority territories back in February. Now, Israel does not commit war crimes. We're going to talk about this. Israel is not a part of the International Criminal Court, but the International Criminal Court is just saying, hey, I'm going to go ahead and authorize a probe into those war crimes. Well, I'm going to talk to you about how much of a humanitarian nation, how much of a soul that Israel has. They're very, very careful when it comes time to a wartime situation and what they need to do. Well, also Iran. Iran's proposing legislation that seeking to destroy Israel in 20 years. That's according to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. The bill was introduced to the Iranian parliament, and it lists the goal of eliminating Israel by 2041. And the four main goals of the legislation include this. This is per the report. Its exact, decisive act of revenge on the U.S. for killing the Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani, which was under the President Trump's administration, and evicting the U.S. from the Middle East. That was one of the goals, to continue Soleimani's mission of destroying Israel, counter alleged economic sanctions, which is deemed terrorism, and to install a defiant foreign policy. And so it's very obvious that Iran, number one state sponsor of terrorism on the planet, they would like to annihilate Israel and the United States. Imagine being over right next door to them, or just a few, maybe 1,000 miles away or something, and they want to develop a nuclear weapon. Imagine Canada or Mexico or South America wanting to destroy the United States, and they're developing nuclear weapons. That's kind of what's going on over there. So they're against Israel. International Criminal Court against Israel. International community is against Israel. On December 23rd, 2016, the Obama administration abstained from voting on the UN Security Council Resolution 2334, and that allowed it to become international law. Well, item number 1 of the UN Security Council Resolution 2334 clearly states that Israel's presence in East Jerusalem, which has the Temple Mount included in it, is illegal and is a flagrant violation of international law. And it states, and I'm quoting, it reaffirms that the establishment of Israel, of the settlements in they call it the Palestinian territory. It's not the Palestinian territory. That's been occupied since 1967. It never was the Palestinian territory. They say, including East Jerusalem, has no legal validity, and it constitutes a flagrant violation under international law and a major obstacle to the achievement of the two-state solution and a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. So this is the mindset of the international community against the eastern section of the city of Jerusalem. They believe the future of Jerusalem must only be negotiated by the Palestinians and Israelis sitting side by side in direct negotiations. And so you can see International Criminal Court, Iran, international community, even the Joe Biden administration, they believe that they've actually come out recently and said that that's the occupied territories, not disputed territories, but occupied territories. So what's all this a result of? Let's go back to some prophecy and make sure we know what's going on here. In Ezekiel chapter 37, in the prophecy of Ezekiel's boneyard, Ezekiel 37 records a prophecy of a valley of dry bones. And God asked Ezekiel, he said, can these bones live? And Ezekiel said, I don't know. I mean, they're awful dry. And he said, God, these are very dry bones. And God said, Ezekiel, prophesy to the bones. Well, you know the story that Ezekiel prophesied and the bones began to come together. And this is the prophecy foretelling the end of the Jewish exile from 70 AD when Jerusalem and the Temple Mount was destroyed, the temple, the second temple. And the Jews were in exile from 70 AD until May 14th, 1948. They were banished from their homeland, sifted through the nations for 1,878 years. And now God has miraculously brought them back together to their promised land. And you and I have witnessed the fulfillment of this amazing prophecy. It's actually ongoing fulfillment because God's still putting the pieces together now. There are still a lot of Jews that are coming back. Time Ministries helps a lot of Jews make Aliyah and come back to Israel, to their homeland. It's a fulfillment of a 2,500-year-old prophecy back in Ezekiel chapter 37. So what I want to do for the rest of the program is I want to talk to you about a method that Israel uses in wartime, and it's a false narrative that the international community and the criminal court has.
Major internet companies are silencing and censoring Christian voices online. These companies are trying to control what you see and hear. Almost 200 videos of ours have been marked as restricted online right now. That's why we launched End of the Age Plus, a platform where the truth won't be censored, a platform where we can preach the message of the gospel. When you subscribe to End of the Age Plus today for just $12.99 a month, you can watch all of our content in a secure, easy-to-view way from your favorite device. When you go to watch.endtime.com and subscribe, you'll get instant access to all of our teaching resources, including Revelation, the Unveiling of Jesus Christ, Understanding the End Time, End Time Magazine, and so much more. We will not censor our message to comply with what the world deems as politically correct. Go to watch.endtime.com right now or search End of the Age Plus in the App Store or Google Play.
We've seen Bible prophecy fulfilled like never before. From the halls of the United Nations to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, Endtime Ministries continues to reveal the Bible prophecy in the news headlines around the world every day. Whether it's through our broadcast or online at our Jerusalem Prophecy College, your gifts enable us to put vital materials in the hands of those who need it most. Because of you, we continue to replace fear with faith in the hearts of Christians around the world. We will continue to see prophecy come to pass at an even swifter pace. We need your support. Your donation of any amount enables us to continue to broadcast and be a voice in the ever-growing censored media. To become a partner or give a one-time gift, visit endtime.com or call 1-800-END-TIME right now. That's 800-363-8463. Go online now. Visit endtime.com.
Okay, so we're going to get back into this Israel prophecy here in just a moment, but I'll have a very important announcement. This coming weekend, I'm going to be doing a prophecy conference in Gladewater, Texas. And we're going to be at the Abundant Life Church at 407 Money Street in Gladewater. And Saturday night at 6 p.m., this will be April 17th, I'll be teaching the new lesson, The Future According to Bible Prophecy, going through this giant timeline, one like you've never seen before. And then Sunday morning at the same church, Abundant Life, 407 Money in Gladewater, this will be April 18th at 10 a.m., we'll be going through an updated Breaking Prophetic Fulfillments, and then that'll be followed by a Q&A. So I look forward to seeing many of you. You've already contacted us about meeting us out there in Gladewater, Texas. That's out there in East Texas. And I don't know if Irvin Baxter may have done one out there years and years and years ago, but looking forward to seeing many of you in Gladewater this weekend. Now, the fulfillment of the prophecy about Ezekiel's dry bones, the coming back together of the nation of Israel, all the bones and the sinew and the muscle, that's not yet complete. Ezekiel prophesied the bones would come together, the muscle came on the bone, but that has now happened. The muscle has come on the bone. Israel is now, think of this, just since 1948, Israel has become the mightiest military force in the Middle East. Israel has nuclear firepower. They've got, I think it's 200 plus nuclear weapons. But the world is against Israel, so it seems like a dire circumstance, right? Israel's always fighting the United Nations and their resolutions, and Iran, and Iran is surrounding them with their terrorist proxies. But the world is against Israel, but God is for Israel. And I'm telling you, folks, when you've got God on your side, nobody can stand against you. All Israel wants to do is to be left alone. Think about this. Israel's not trying to invade other countries and take over Jordan or, Lebanon, Egypt. They're not trying to do that. All Israel wants is to be left alone. And that's why they call their military the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. They're defensive. Just, hey, all we want is defensible borders. So on today's program, I want to flip the false narrative on its head. The Fox News, they reported, I just saw this, that the Biden administration announced that it will restore $235 million in humanitarian funding for programs that support Palestinian economic relief. The Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, he said that the United States will relaunch policies that were stopped during the Trump administration, including the $150 million for the UN Relief and Works Agency. That would be, we refer to that as UNRWA. You've heard me and Irvin Baxter and several of us mention UNRWA. Well, that's what it is. And it's a funding initiative that has frustrated Republican members of Congress. And Secretary Lindsey Graham, he said that I'm deeply troubled by these recent decisions from the Biden administration to turn a blind eye to the behavior by the Palestinian Authority. Because many times the international community will look at that and say, hey, Israel bombed the Palestinians again and this happened, but yet they never say, they might not even, just mention how almost continually that there are bombs flying from Gaza into Israel, or they're digging tunnels and all these different things. And so also in 2019, the Palestinian Authority provided $343 million to subsidize what we refer to as pay for slay. And these pay for slay attacks are where terrorists and their families receive cash rewards for attacking Israelis and Americans. Now think about this. When do you hear about this on CNN? You never hear about this. And he also added that alleging the Biden administration was subsidizing terrorism. That's exactly what we're doing. But yet the International Criminal Court, now I mentioned earlier, the International Criminal Court authorized a probe into the alleged Israeli war crimes in the Palestinian Authority territories. Well, what Israel is doing is just saying, hey, you've lobbed all these rockets, you're digging all these tunnels to get your terrorist proxies in here. We're done with that. And there comes a time when they will go in there and they will blow up like these where they've had bombs cached. But the problem is they cache them under a library or under a school or under some civilians' homes. And that's how they protect them, because they know Israel does not want to go in and just bomb civilians to take out these big military caches. But it's spun in the news. I mean, the International Criminal Court is saying, hey, Fatwa Ben Swada, she is saying, hey, I'm going to go in and I'm going to approve a probe into war crimes about Israel. So what I want you to do today is I want you to know the truth about Israel. Israel is very careful, even during battle, to protect civilian lives. And they're going the extra mile and beyond. But you don't hear much about this in the news unless it's like an Israeli source. And so I want to make sure that we explain really what's going on behind the scenes, just in this one area of life and of the geopolitical situation going on over there in Israel. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of the knock on the roof by Israel. The Jerusalem Post wrote a great article, how the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, invented roof knocking, or the knock on the roof, and it's the tactic that saves lives in Gaza. Again, you'll never hear about this on CNN, MSNBC. They don't talk about this kind of stuff that I've seen. And it's mostly Israeli sources that are trying to say, hey, world, look at what we're doing here. But yet the international criminal community, Iran, the International Criminal Court, and all these other different entities, the boycott, divest, and sanction, everybody's against Israel. Why? Because Satan is against Israel. Satan hates Israel, and that's where all this is going to lead to the Battle of Armageddon eventually. Now, what happened with this knock on the roof? You will find this a very interesting point of interest, and I think you'll enjoy this because you need to know. In 2008, after a year of incessant rocket fire, the Israeli government decided enough was enough. It was time to go back into the Gaza Strip and do everything possible to take down Hamas, the terrorist faction down there. So while there was a ceasefire had been in effect for 6 months, sporadic rocket fire, these Qassams and mortars, they continued to rain down on Israel. But again, you don't hear much about this on the nightly news. You'll hear about Israel going back in trying to confront that. That's why I'm kind of setting the record straight here about Israel. But nevertheless, the government had initially preferred quiet. The situation was tenuous, but the residents of the south were, for the first time in years, able to leave their homes in southern Israel to some measure of safety because there was a ceasefire. The government wasn't going to put that at a risk so quickly. So In November, the calculation changed, though, because the IDF received intelligence that Hamas was digging these terror tunnels across the border into Israel, and it was similar to the one that had been used 2.5 years earlier to kidnap Gilad Shalit. You remember he was a soldier in the armored corps, and Shalit was still being held by Hamas somewhere in Gaza, and the IDF decided that, hey, the ticking tunnel, as it was being called, it had to be destroyed. So, an elite Israeli Defense Force, a force from the paratroopers brigade, they were sent across the border near the home under which the tunnel was being dug. And in a subsequent firefight, a few Palestinian gunmen were killed. At one point, a large bomb went off in the home and it brought down the structure and it collapsed the tunnel. So the Hamas response, obviously a rocket onslaught was immediate. Dozens of Qassams, Katyushas, and mortar shells pounded the south, and it reached as far as Ashdod. Well, a rocket attack led to an Israeli Air Force bombing, and then more rockets and more airstrikes. And by mid-December, the truce, which is Tadiyah in Arabic, had completely fallen apart. And only a handful of people knew that at the same time as Israeli diplomats were trying to salvage the ceasefire with Egyptian assistance, the Shin Bet, or the Israeli Security Agency, and the IAF, the Israeli Air Force, they were busy building back a bank of Hamas targets. In other words, where was Hamas's headquarters, their arms caches, command posts, tunnel openings, because they would go right in under civilian homes, start digging a tunnel, and then go across. Well, the only way to destroy the entire tunnel was to destroy the home that the tunnel was coming up into. They'd bring the whole house down. So their military was looking for these tunnel openings, their rocket launchers. The problem is that civilian homes, schools, hospitals, their mosques even, I mean, everything was being used by Hamas to hide their weapons, and everything was being added to the Israeli Defense Forces list. But if you're the Israeli Defense Forces, just think, you're not going to go down and start blowing up schools and libraries and all this other stuff, at least not without giving them a warning. Most people would just go in and bomb them. But the Israeli Defense Forces said, well, we can't do that. It's not in the Israeli heart to go in there and do that. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to give them a warning. And that's what I want to cover throughout the rest of my program, is the different warnings that they've given them, because the international community in different places, these entities, they want to make it out like the Israelis have no heart, that they're occupying the land, and they don't even have a right to be in much of that land where they're at, like the West Bank and East Jerusalem and things like that. They're saying that that's illegal in the eyes of the international community. And what this is all leading to, all this pressure, is the eventual battle of Armageddon, not the Sixth Trumpet War. That's going to be different. All of this stuff is leading us to the battle of Armageddon. But I want you to know the truth of all of this, because Israel is very, very careful, again, going way beyond to try to protect civilians. And it's a very good thing. So, on December 27th that year at 11:30 a.m., what would become later known as Operation Cast Lead, many of you are familiar with this, that was launched with the bombing of 50 different targets by dozens of Israeli Air Force fighter jets and attack helicopters. Well, the planes reported that alpha hits, or that's Air Force lingo for a direct hit on their target, an alpha hit. Some 30 minutes later, a second wave of 60 jets and helicopters struck another 60 targets. Now, these are very pinpoint. They're not just going in there and bombing the whole towns. They know exactly which home to hit, which school, and they've warned people. And it's including underground rocket launchers and all kinds of things that these people have all these caches. They've had spies go down there, infiltrate, and find out where all these caches are, and they were going in and bombing them. And they were placed inside bunkers and missile silos that had been fitted with timers. They went in and bombed the whole thing. Well, in all, more than 170 targets were hit by the IAF and the aircraft throughout the first day. Palestinians reported more than 200 Gazans were killed and another 800 were wounded. Well, Operation Cast Lead would be remembered as the first large-scale war in Gaza since, and you understand where, if you had a map of Israel, you have the map of Israel here, and then in the southwestern portion, right against the Mediterranean, it always comes down into like a, down in here in the, if I was looking at a clock, the face of a clock, it would be maybe around 7:30, right down here in the nation of Israel. That's where Gaza is. Well, so this would be Operation Cast Lead. It was remembered as the first large-scale war in Gaza since Israel's unilateral withdrawal from the Strip 3 years earlier under Ariel Sharon. So it would also be, it would go down in history for the United Nations fact-finding mission known as the Goldstone Report that would be established and accuse Israel of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, I told you about the tunnels and everything else that they had done, everything, all of the bombs that had been shot over into Israel, but it went down as war crimes against Israel. So, ahead of the operation, Israeli intelligence agencies knew they had to adapt. And since the withdrawal from Gaza 3 years earlier, they no longer had a physical presence on the ground inside, and now this Hamas-controlled territory. And while they could use spies and electronic sensors to identify targets, they would not be able to know in real time what was happening in a specific target. So they developed a way to better recognize the targets and to warn the people, hey, we're going to come in and we're going to bomb a target which has all this bombs and different things cached in there. And they developed a way to warn them prior.
Move Mountains with Irvin Baxter. This book by Irvin's grandson provides 30 days of devotion that will enhance your relationship with God and others. Authentic illustrations from early morning devotions at Endtime will help you find your purpose and eliminate fears. Commit to taking this 30-day journey and experience real life change. Get your book for only $14.99. Call 1-800-363-8463 or go to endtime.com/move.
Major internet companies are silencing and censoring Christian voices online. These companies are trying to control what you see and hear. Almost 200 videos of ours have been marked as restricted online right now. That's why we launched End of the Age Plus, a platform where the truth won't be censored, a platform where we can preach the message of the gospel. When you subscribe to End of the Age Plus today for just $12.99 a month, you can watch all of our content in a secure, easy-to-view way from your favorite device. When you go to watch.endtime.com and subscribe, you'll get instant access to all of our teaching resources, including Revelation, the Unveiling of Jesus Christ, Understanding the End Time, End Time Magazine, and so much more. We will not censor our message to comply with what the world deems as politically correct. Go to watch.endtime.com right now or search End of the Age Plus in the App Store or Google Play.
If your station only carries the first 30 minutes of End of the Age, go to endtime.com and click the watch button to continue today's broadcast. You can also finish up later by clicking the archive button.
So, one thing that the IDF knew was that Hamas was storing weapons in their homes and in apartment buildings, under schools, mosques, and hospitals. And if a war erupted, Israel had to find a way to attack the targets while at the same time reducing civilian casualties and collateral damage. And recognizing this challenge, the Shin Bet did something new. It created a list of phone numbers. Now, they went to this extent. Most people, They just go in. But not, these people went to this extent. They developed a list of phone numbers belonging to the owners of the homes, office buildings, hospitals, and throughout the Gaza Strip. And it was a Sisyphean effort, never undertaken by another military. So think about the scale of this. But Israel knew it didn't have a choice. They were trying to protect civilian lives. All they wanted to do was take out the military weapons. So while they were collecting the phone numbers, that was difficult. Their use was supposed to be simple. I mean, the IDF knew that they were basically two categories of targets. The first were terrorists, Palestinians perpetrating an attack or in the midst of planning one, and then those people were not going to get called before being attacked because they're terrorists, okay? And to successfully hit them, Israel needed to retain the element of surprise, even if that meant some innocent civilians would unfortunately be caught in the crosshairs. The second category included the homes, apartment buildings, offices, mosques, other civilian buildings where Hamas and Islamic Jihad had stored their weapons, set up command posts, or used as a cover to hide a cross-border terror tunnel. Now, these were the targets that would get phone calls in order to give the people inside the opportunity to leave. Now, again, I said no other military had ever done this. But because Israel knew that civilians would be inside the buildings, the IDF and the Shin Bet created a new operational doctrine. Before they would attack, it would take the extra precaution of contacting the building owner or the occupant. They'd give them a call. Now think about this. They give them a call, but, hey, I'm fixing to bomb your building. So the callers had a standard text that they read in Arabic that went something like this. They said, hi, how are you? Is everything okay? This is the Israeli military, and we need to bomb your home. And we're making every effort to minimize casualties. So please make sure that no one is nearby, because in 5 minutes, we're bombing the place. And then the line would go dead. Now, this is actually what happened, everybody. And in every case, an Israeli drone would be hovering above, which was what happened, which was to see what was happening in the home and nearby. Once it saw that people were running out of the building, the IAF headquarters would give the fighter pilot or the attack helicopter the green light to drop their bomb. And in some cases, the Palestinians claimed that Israeli drones were also used to launch missiles, although Israel has never officially confirmed that it has attacked drones. Well, for the most part, the tactic worked to perfection. A building would be brought to the Shin Bet from their spies and different things, and to the Southern Command's attack center, where it would be added to the list of targets. And there, on the second floor of the plain-looking gray structure in Beersheba, this base headquarters, the IDF soldiers and the Shin Bet analysts would discuss what to do and how to attack. The IDF officers would allocate the necessary attack platform and ensure it was available. Once the mission was approved, an Arabic-speaking intelligence officer would call the owner. And the drone would show that the people inside the building had left. The soldiers in the IDF command center would count the number of people who had left. I told you this was very detailed, and it's very important to Israel that they kill no civilians, and ensuring the number that were matched up with the intelligence that they had received, and then they would give the IAF the green light to attack. So, but this is a progression. For the first 40 strikes, everything worked very smoothly. Some officers privately wondered among themselves, hey, well, you know, why the Palestinians didn't go to the roof and try to prevent the bombing. They said that one of the military planners at the time said, hey, we knew that if they did that we would have to call off the strike because they didn't want to kill civilians living in the home. Well, the calls were made and empty buildings were struck. But then one day, the officers' fears came true. One of the Palestinians, whose two-story home was a known Hamas weapons storage center, he told the Israeli intelligence officer, on the phone, when he got the call, he said, "No, I'm not leaving." So word was circulating around Gaza about the new tactic that, hey, you're going to get a call 5 minutes before they bomb your house. And people knew that exiting the building would mean not having a home to return to, because Israel was going to level it. Well, the family climbed to the roof knowing a drone was up above, and they started making indecent gestures at the Israeli aircraft. And so amongst the IDF, a disagreement broke out in the command center. Some of the officers thought Israel needed to go ahead with the attack. But others pushed back and said, no. The Jewish state said that we couldn't strike a building while knowing that there were civilians inside. The commander of the Southern Command was updated, and the issue eventually made its way up to the Chief of Staff, and both agreed that the strike could not go forward. Even though they knew the weapons and the bombs and all those different things were in the house, they would call it off because they did not want to kill the civilians. Well, the next day, another Palestinian refused to leave his home, and the surveillance drone showed he had also climbed up on the roof. Well, of course, the news spread throughout throughout Gaza. And the commander in the attack center watched the live feed with curiosity. And to be honest, they didn't know what to do because they didn't want to just go in killing civilians. Well, on the other hand, but on the one hand, they were dealing with a legitimate military target. There were bombs in the house. They knew it. And yes, it had been a house or an apartment building, but once it was being used for military purposes, and it had morphed into a military target according to the laws of war. The question now was about proportionality, a rule prohibiting attacks that may cause loss of life in excess of military gain from an attack. And this was a legal question that required constant consultations with Shavit Baruch and her team of lawyers. So Zvika Fogel, he's a retired brigadier general. He was in the room, the war room that day. He was seeing all this going on, and he's a reservist. Fogel had served a deputy commander in the Southern Command in the early 2000s. When Cass Lead broke out, Fogel was called up to run the attack center, and every target had to be signed off by him, whether it was a home, a mosque, or a terrorist on a motorbike fleeing a just-used rocket launcher. And this war hit close to home for Fogel. On January 5th, an IDF Merkava tank shot a shell at a building in a Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza. And the tank crew was mistakenly identified. They had mistakenly identified movement in the structure for Hamas terrorists when they were actually Israeli infantry soldiers from the Golani Brigade, and 3 troops were killed and 24 more were wounded. So Fogel oversaw the evacuation of the wounded. And he's sitting in the war room at this point. He's studying the whole thing. And it would be remembered as the evacuation of the wounded will be remembered as one of the more complicated evacuations in IDF history. Well, once the tank had fired its shell, Hamas terrorists opened fire in the direction of the tank, and the building and the whole street became a war zone, and it made it very difficult, obviously, to get the wounded out of the building. But they did get them out. So the IDF launched artillery shells to create a smokescreen and provide cover for the troops to get out of this obviously densely populated area into the open, where helicopters could then were trying to land and to fly the wounded across the border to the Israeli hospitals. And as he was overseeing the complex operation, Fogel had no clue that one of the wounded was his own son, Dor, who had been inside the building when the tank shell struck. So thankfully, he sustained only light injuries. He was not killed in that attack. But after the first time, one of the telephone Palestinians refused to leave his home, Fogel gathered his men in the attack center for a consultation on, hey, what do we do, guys? The home was a legitimate target and had been authorized by Shavit Baruch's team, the group of lawyers. But on the other hand, Fogel knew that attacking would incur many civilian casualties, and whatever tactical gain Israel might achieve from the bombing, it would be for naught. So one of the offers recalled the neighbor procedure. Again, I said this effort was progressive, but wait till you see how it ends up. So one of the offers recalled the neighbor procedure, and it was a controversial tactic employed by the infantry units that during operations in the West Bank in the beginning of the Second Intifada. The procedure, which it was eventually banned by the High Court of Justice, involved Israeli soldiers sending a neighbor or a relative of a wanted Palestinian terror suspect to knock on the door. Now, this is the extent they went to actually knock on the door before going in themselves. The idea was that the terror suspect wouldn't open fire if they knew their cousin or their neighbor was standing outside. So while that couldn't be applied in the same way in Gaza, IDF troops were not always going to be on the ground, so the officers started throwing around different ideas to achieve the same goal, to minimize casualties on the Israeli side and Palestinian side as well. They were worried about their enemies. You understand what's going on here. But yet the International Criminal Court today wants to probe them for war crimes. So, the neighbor procedure was an effort used to minimize harm to our soldiers, they said, and we thought how we could take it and do something else that could reduce harm to the Palestinian civilians. This was Fogel. So Fogel was highly motivated to find a solution. In 1996, he was a commander of an artillery brigade operating in Lebanon during Operation Grapes of Wrath that started with the objective of stopping Hezbollah rocket fire into northern Israel. Well, now, 12 years later, Fogel was again fighting in an operation that had been launched to defend Israeli citizens and again was facing a similar problem like they had in the Grapes of Wrath. Civilian casualties would undermine Israel's legitimacy to act. So, how do they stop bombs from flying into the nation without killing everybody? So the world would condemn the country and the government would ultimately succumb to the pressure and stop the IDF. So, a couple of days later, when another Palestinian refused to evacuate his house, one of the officers on Fogel's team come up with an innovative idea. He suggested sending an F-15 or an F-16 to dip low over the home in Gaza to break the sound barrier and to try to scare the people inside. They would know an Israeli jet just flew over and they recognized, hey, something's going to happen, we're going to get bombed. But then another officer had an even better idea. And the house that they did it in was next to an empty field. And we'll continue on with this, and I want you to understand the extent that Israel will go to protect civilian lives, but the International Criminal Court is against them for war crimes.
Most of us walk around day by day blind to the prophecies being fulfilled right before us. Every news report brings a new piece to the puzzle in the race towards the final 7 years and the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, more than ever, it is important for God's people to understand the times in which we are living. On November the 12th, 2013, we opened our Jerusalem Prophecy College in downtown Jerusalem. These same courses are now available online for people who are unable to attend the classes in person. We welcome students to join us and discover the link between current events and the prophecies of the Bible. Take your place in the prophecy of Daniel 11:33. Enroll in the Jerusalem Prophecy College today. Go to JerusalemProphecyCollege.com.
So, what was the idea that the officer suggested? He said, hey guys, he said, why don't we have a helicopter fire some warning shots into the empty field right next to the house that we're going to bomb? Well, the Southern Command officers liked the idea and they tried it out, and it worked, and the residents fled the building. So the problem was that the IDF would not always have an empty lot next to the structure that wanted to attack. So it needed to come up with a better method. And there, one of the brigade officers says that it was kind of like what we would do with a terror suspect who refused to leave his home in the West Bank. This was a Nahal brigade officer who was he was stationed at the attack center. He said, we would first fire a standard 5.56 millimeter machine gun bullet at the door. If that didn't work, we would fire a heavier cannon, and if that didn't work, then we would throw a grenade. Because they're trying to save the guy's life, they just want him to get out. Well, after a few more times, the IDF had refined the tactic. And it selected a missile developed by Israel Aerospace Industries, known for being small, accurate, and capable of being configured to carry a limited amount of explosives. After calling and encountering a refusal to leave the home, the Air Force will first fire one of those missiles on the roof. And it's usually going to be fired into a corner, very accurate, and far from where people might be standing. In some cases, the missiles can be configured to burst in the air, minimizing even more the chances of casualties. And once the Palestinians experience the roof knocking or the knock on the roof, hey, we're gonna explode a bomb on top of your roof, but not blow the building up yet. In almost all cases, when this happens, the terrorist and the people inside flee the building. After the Israeli drones verify the people have left, the Air Force then drops a heavier bomb, destroying the structure. And when I say destroying the structure, you can go on YouTube and check out Israel's knock on the roof, and it's got a small bomb that explodes on top of the building, but it doesn't even hurt the roof, maybe a few bricks or something. But then about a few minutes later, the whole building it just explodes, it's flattened. So this didn't go unnoticed, what Israel was doing. In a report published by the United Nations, Israel's use of roof knocking was harshly criticized, with investigators concluding that the technique is non-effective as a warning and constitutes a form of attack against the civilians inhabiting the building. Okay, so one case that drew international condemnation back in July of 2018 when 2 Palestinian teenagers were accidentally killed in a roof knocking operation on an empty building in Gaza. In a reconstruction of the accident, but Salem found that the IEF had fired 4 warning shots at the building and that the first one had killed the boys as they sat on the roof taking selfies with their legs dangling over the edge. The attack, but Salem said at the time, showed how roof knocking was not just a warning, but was a real attack and therefore needed to conform to international rules of law. But Israel has rejected this assumption. So even if warning shots were considered an attack, it is incorrect to view them as an attack against civilians because they're not fired at civilians, since the objective of their use is to avoid harm to civilians. And so, despite the criticisms, Israel has continued in the years since Cass led to use roof knocking in its Gaza operations, and out of a combination of tactical and strategic interest. Tactically, commanders recognize the need to minimize collateral damage and civilian casualties. Strategically, Israel's political and military leaders know that when there are fewer casualties, there's less of a chance of a wider escalation with Hamas, and both are clear Israeli interests. So with the International Criminal Court in The Hague now investigating Israel's 2014 war in Gaza, Israel will once again have to defend its tactics and explain with precautions what it takes to minimize civilian casualties in an effort in which the roof knocking plays a critical role. When looking back on the day when the IDF came up with roof knocking, it illustrated a determination to adhere to a level of morality not often seen in the midst of battle. Think about this. Israel could have easily taken a way out and attacked without phone calls or warning strikes, but it didn't. The IDF officers and soldiers in the command center adapted to an evolving situation without having a thoroughly thought out and carefully crafted doctrine for what to do, nor special technology that would guarantee success. But they had their objective to adhere to Jewish values and of going the extra mile to protect civilian life, and they acted accordingly. And that is the story of the roof knocking, or Israel's knock on the roof. But you can see how far Israel will go to protect civilians and to save lives. Israel would never go down into Gaza and bomb them if they weren't having these tunnels and kidnapping Israelis and these attack tunnels and shooting rockets over it in Israel. Israel has the Israel Defense Forces. And so it's very, very important that you and I know the false narratives that are being pushed around the world, really, but mostly against Israel many times. And how is all this going to end? I mean, that's the question. Why am I talking about it today? Because Israel is a good nation. They've got good people. But the international community, Iran, all these different nations are against Israel. And most resolutions at the United Nations are passed against Israel. Did you know that? So where's all this going to end? It's going to end at Armageddon. The international armies of the UN are going to invade Israel from the north, probably to implement resolutions like a Resolution 2334. And the battle's going to be joined at the plain of Megiddo in northern Israel, and Israel's going to fight valiantly against the world government armies. But the Israeli Defense Forces are going to fall back slowly but surely before this superior firepower of the world government. And the conflict is going to proceed with Israel retreating back towards its capital, Jerusalem, and after days of exhausting battle, Israel's going to make her last stand within the walls of Jerusalem, right there in the Kidron Valley, between the Temple Mount and the Mount of Olives. And in spite of her heroic efforts by the Israeli soldiers, the Jewish people will find themselves facing defeat by the armies of the Antichrist. And it's at that time that the seventh and the last trump's going to sound. Jesus Christ is going to return to gather the elect from the earth. It's Matthew 24, 29 through 31. Have the marriage supper of the Lamb and go with His saints to fight on behalf of Israel at the Battle of Armageddon. It's Revelation 19. And during the Battle of Armageddon, the seventh vial will be poured out upon the earth. And this will result in great hailstones being rained upon the armies that have come down to fight against Israel at Armageddon. Zechariah 14:4 tells us that Jesus will place His feet on the Mount of Olives just outside of Jerusalem there when He comes to the earth on the east. And when this happens, there will be a huge earthquake that splits the Mount of Olives in two, killing 7,000 people in the city of Jerusalem. And when Jesus touches down on the Mount of Olives, all of Israel is going to rush out to meet Him. And when they bow before their Messiah, they're going to notice the nail scars in His hands and in His feet. And they're going to realize that, hey, you are Jesus. You are our Messiah. And they're going to receive Him as their Lord and as their God. That's Zechariah 12:10 and 13:6. And Scripture tells us that all of Israel will be saved at that time. That's Romans 11:25 and 26. That's where all of this is headed. We're watching precursors pointing us to the Battle of Armageddon, the international community, the world against Israel. Now, thankfully, we know that up to the Battle of Armageddon, that the United States will protect Israel during that last time. Now, at this time, you can see President Biden's administration kind of trying to straddle the fence. Yeah, we'll stand with Israel, but we're going to go back into the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal with Iran. We're going to lift the sanctions there. We're going to stand, President Biden is he's a clear globalist. He supports the world government. So Will this happen under the Biden administration? I don't know that. I mean, we know we're at least 3.5 years away. If you look at the timeline, that the final 3.5 years when the Bible says that the United States will protect Israel, we're at the very least 3.5 years away from that. That's the final 3.5 years of the final 7. And so the Biden administration will probably be done by then unless he gets reelected. I mean, I don't know how that's going to play out at this point. All I know is how the prophecies are going to play out. The Bible says the United States is not part of that end-time world government, and that Revelation 12:14, she's carried away on the wings of a great eagle, where she's nourished in her place for time, times, and the dividing of time, or half a time, that final 3.5 year period known as the Great Tribulation. And so this is where we're all headed. And of course, the Battle of Armageddon happens at the very end of that. But there's got to be a condition in the international community that's against Israel that will bring the nations of the world down against Israel. We're already seeing this happening, folks. And even the Biden administration has said East Jerusalem and the West Bank is considered occupied territories. Not disputed. They are disputed, but the Biden administration agrees with Resolution 2334. Resolution 2334 that says it's illegal was allowed to pass in the United Nations under the Obama-Biden administration. And so how all this is going to play out, it's going to be something for us to watch in the near future. Because the Bible says that we're going to stand with Israel till the end. The United States is Israel's #1 ally on the planet. And so it's very, very important that we understand how these things are going to play out. We're watching precursors to the eventual Battle of Armageddon being set up now. In other words, the Antichrist isn't going to come and everything's going to happen just in a couple weeks and then the Battle of Armageddon happens. No. There's precursors to this stuff being set up right now. We're watching the ongoing fulfillment of Bible prophecies. These are 2,000-year-old prophecies. These are 2,500-year-old prophecies when you talk about Zechariah coming to pass and the Battle of Armageddon, 2,500-year-old prophecies, and we're watching the ongoing fulfillment of this. We've watched Israel gathered back together as a nation. The bones come together. Muscle came on the bones. But there will come a time in the near future where God will breathe His Spirit into Israel. And it's going to be a very, very awesome time. And that's when all of Israel is going to be saved, when He plants His feet on the Mount of Olives. That's Romans chapter 11, verse 25 and 26. But hopefully I've cleared up some misconception on what's going on with the International Criminal Court and the roof knocking that Israel does. God bless. See you next time.
This has been End of the Age, brought to you by the faithful partners of Endtime Ministries. If you're not currently a partner with Endtime Ministries, or if you would like more information, we invite you to call us at 1-800-ENDTIME. That's 1-800-363-8463, or visit us online at endtime.com.
Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel and like our Facebook page.